Welcome to the glamorous Southeast Review office, where you and I have snuck off in the dead of night to talk about the speaker of a poem. Come on in. If you flipped the definition of the word speaker in the Princeton, it'll redirect you to two things: persona and voice. We're going to flip to the section on persona for a couple of reasons. When people use the term voice to talk about the voice of a poem, a lot of times that relies on what I consider to be kind of like woo-woo ideas, where you can hear the poet if you read it enough. And I don't know, maybe some people can channel the spirits of the dead, or maybe if you read a poet enough, you can sort of hear something similar to their voice. But I don't believe in the sort of essentialist rhetoric that surrounds this notion of a voice existing outside of space and time. I do, however, subscribe to the notion of persona, and it has a little bit of a backstory. So let's look at how the Princeton defines it, and let's look at the backstory too real quick. Old Faithful here says, persona denotes the speaker, or more generally, the source of any poem that is imagined to be spoken in a distinctive voice or is narrated from a determinate vantage, whether that speaker is presumed to be the poet, a fictional character, or even an inanimate object. Okay, cool. So what does this tell us? The speaker is not the same thing as the poet. So when we're talking about poems and we talk about the person who is speaking in the poem, we don't say the poet says blah, blah, blah. We say the speaker says blah, blah, blah. And there are a couple reasons for this. Here's the backstory. Cicero and Seneca have two different ideas of what persona meant. In Cicero's idea of persona, in his theory, he says that persona shows something true or honest, or reveals some foundational characteristic of the person speaking. Whereas Seneca tends to side on the opposite. Whereas Seneca tends to think of things quite the opposite. For Seneca, the persona, this cultivated voice, is more of a public performance than anything. One of the things that I want to know is that the speaker of the poem, even if it's... One of the things that I want to know is that the speaker of the poem, even if they're saying something the poet totally agrees with, is not the poet. It's words on a page. It literally cannot be the poet. And that draws us to another fact about poetry, which is that it's not some sort of uncultivated, unthought out overflow of ideas. If you've ever had the chance to try to write down what somebody says as they're speaking, or transcribe the captions for these videos, you will know that people don't speak nearly as neatly as the dialogue we see in prose, or in the ideas or even dialogue that we see in poetry. The reason this matters is because when you're cultivating speakers for your poems, be intentional about it. We have a whole list of different qualities that we'll look at today as we go through some of these poems, but decide if your speaker is going to be honest or dishonest, if they're going to be emotionally near to the subject at hand or emotionally distant from it. Decide if they are going to be human or non-human, or if they're going to shift through some of these things. So rather than speak in these generalizations, I'm going to mention some important quality of each of the speakers in the poems in our packet, and then we'll take a close look at two of them in particular. Okay, who do we have first? We have The Red Poppy by Louise Glück. We'll look at this one in detail, but short thing to note right now is the speaker is literally the red poppy. In JoJo's by Christopher Davis, I want you to focus on emotional distance in that poem. In The Kid by I, the poet I creates a speaker that is terrifying. One of the liberties that we get whenever we create a fictitious speaker, especially in the case of the dramatic monologue, in which we reveal some sort of inner workings of that speaker's mind, is you get to explore people you would never be. The poem Litany, in which certain things are crossed out by Richard Sykin, is a masterclass in foregrounding the fact of the speaker as something that's important to the poem itself. We have a dishonest speaker. At times it seems to be a princess, at times it seems to be a dragon, at times it seems to be the poet himself. And we'll look at how it's all of and none of these things. And next we have, after that long poem, Death of a Naturalist by Seamus Heaney. And the reason I included this poem in the packet is because this is a past tense speaker. It's written in the present tense throughout the poem. However, the big revelation of the poem is something that could only come with age, with time. In the Amy Nez poem, the speaker is in fact not one person, and it's not one flower, and it's not a princess, but it's a whole combination of speakers. She's woven together emails that she's received and created a poem that's comprised of sort of a patchwork of these speakers. Another of the poems, The Blessing of the Old Woman, the Tulip, and the Dog, is literally written from those three different perspectives, from the perspective of the old woman archetype, the tulip archetype, the dog archetype. And in the additional reading, we see some speakers who appear to be much closer to who the poet is, who seem to speak from that first-person lived experience that might be similar to the poet's, but can never actually be the poet as the speaker in the poem, because, like I mentioned, the poet's not on the page, the speaker is. Do you see the difference there? If you want to explore this idea in a little bit more detail, join me in the comments below, or if you're in my class, in the discussion on Canvas. That's enough to be said about these poems. Generally, let's look specifically at Louise Glick's poem. The Red Poppy by Louise Glick. The great thing is not having a mind. Feelings? Oh, I have those. They govern me. I have a Lord in heaven called the sun, and open for him, showing him the fire of my own heart, fire like his presence. What could such glory be, if not a heart? Oh, my brothers and sisters, were you like me once, long ago, before you were human? Did you permit yourselves to open once, who would never open again? Because in truth, I am speaking now the way you do. I speak because I am shattered. Oof. First of all, one of my favorite poems of all time. It's just a devastator. If you want to start with an incredible book of poems, get this one, The Wild Iris. First thing to do is just let's take a look at our checklist for speaker. The disposition. How would you describe the emotional state of the speaker of this poem, the red poppy? There's a pretty good hint at the end of that poem. And in terms of the emotional nearness or distance, I'll just say that one of the things about these poems is the precision of calculating an environment, an emotional status, of rendering a story. There are narrative aspects to a lot of these poems. I'm not sure the extent to which there's a narrative aspect here, but consider, for example, the way the speaker says feelings. Oh, I have those. They govern me. It's a complicated emotional quality that we see there. It's not entirely it's not a bleeding heart, but it's also not a cold figure. The speaker is emotionally complex and highly self-aware. Obviously, on the scale of human to non-human, this is a red poppy speaking, but with human experiences. So we might call that personification, right? In terms of present, past, or future, think about the way that these assertions operate somewhat outside of time. The great thing is not having a mind is a description of a fact that characterizes the speaker's experience, their lived, embodied experience. Feelings, oh, I have those, they govern me. How that situates the speaker in time is the sort of continuous experience once again. There's certainly an emotional intensity here, but I'm not sure how emotionally near the speaker is to the subject at hand, considering, of course, that the gesture in which this poem is operating is not narrative. If we look at this list real quick, does it observe or describe a setting? Well, no. Does it emote or evoke? I would say yes. It's pretty lyric in that way. Does it contemplate or imagine something? It's certainly contemplative, so this seems to be sort of a meditation on being. Does it tell or plot? No. Does it think and argue? Somewhat, maybe. So when we think about the different gestures from our Trappings of a Poem handout, it's checking a few of these boxes. What I'd like to do is consider one of the organizing principles in this poem, which is syntax. How does the language move? How does Louise Glick decide on a line? What's contained in a single line? And how do we have what I would call tension or torque as we move down the page, which is how does cutting a line off at this word versus that word increase or otherwise impact anticipation? So let's take a look. The great thing, so the focus is on the thing, is not having a mind. Feelings, so feelings come to replace that mind. The great thing is not having a mind. The thing is not this. Feelings it is that. So the thing is not this, the thing is that. Feelings, and then what happens? We move from that assertion, the thing is not this, it is that, to what that thing does. Feelings, it's something I have. Feelings govern me. One of the things that I'll note about this here is in those 3 lines, feelings, oh, I have those, they govern me. Who has the power, who has autonomy, switches quickly. The great thing is this objective, grandiose statement. Is not having is a reversal of that statement, insofar as it goes from an assertion to a negation. A mind, that's a movement into a particular example of the great thing through negation. Feelings, another negation, which brings us back to a positive or an assertion of what thing is. Feelings, oh, I have those. I have feelings. I possess those feelings. But then suddenly they switch, govern me. Holy crap, what a sentence. What a couple of sentences. So much movement here just in terms of the syntax. And the way that it's organized is so procedural, it's argumentative, it's contemplating through the syntax. This is not a list of images, for example. It's a focus on the parts of speech and the way that the parts of speech can create tension or torque. It can help us characterize the speaker of a poem. The amount of attention paid here to the argumentative structure of syntax characterizes the speaker. This is a red poppy who is highly self-conscious of its lived experience, its emotionality. And how do we know that? Well, because of the presence of deeply considered language here. But also, this poppy wants to say, I do have wildly intense emotional experiences. Let me show you. I have a Lord in heaven called the Sun and open for him. So what does that mean? Well, I have a Lord in heaven. Well, it's a reverse personification here. The poppy is saying, I have the sun. The way that you people might understand the sun is if I call it a Lord in heaven. And how do I know that? Because as we go forward, the poppy says, and I open for him, showing him the fire of my own heart, fire like his presence. And then as soon as we think we know what this poppy is talking about, the poppy says, what could such glory be if not a heart? What does the poppy show? The red of her petals, or his petals, or their petals. The poppy opens up to the sun, shows the fire of its heart. So what we have so far is a grand assertion, the great thing, followed by a negation, is not having a mind, followed by another reversal, which is, if it's not the mind, it is this other thing, feelings, oh, I have those. And another reversal, I have those, no, they govern me. What do I have? I have the sun. What do I do for the sun? I open up to it. And then we have what I'll call the second half of the poem, which is when it switches to addressing a specific audience, my brothers and sisters. Were you like me once long ago before you were human? So the poem tells us what these brothers and sisters are. Did you permit yourselves to open once who would never open again? It asks the people a question. It tries to help us understand its experience as it explores our experience, because in truth, I am speaking now the way you do. I speak because I am shattered. What I don't know and wouldn't want to tell you is what this poem means. What I do know and can show you is how to pay attention to these intentional syntactical choices. The best way to do that is to slow down with each line and ask it what it's doing. What is it comprised of? Obviously, we're not working just with images. We have an agon, an occasion, an idea. We have some narrative, which is, I do this thing. But the surmise of the poem is a sort of synthesis of its 2 parts. The poppy explains the poppy's experience. It reaches out toward brothers and sisters who are human. And in that reaching outward, both to the Father, which is the Son, and both to brothers and sisters, which are human, it connects us, the human readers, to its lived experience. So the poem ends on that synthesis of the speaker describing their own experiences and then reaching out to ask us or relate to ours. Now, this can be useful to you on so many different levels as you consider drafting your own poems. The most basic and forthright is this is a poem written from the perspective of a red poppy, and yet it is a poem that investigates a complex emotional and psychological experience. If I write a poem from the perspective of this white wall, that wall can have a complex emotional and psychological experience. It doesn't have to be what I think of it as. It can be what it might think of me as. Let's flip to the next poem in Richard Seichen's book and see what can be said about what he does similarly or differently. Now, I can't go through and read this poem part by part because it's very long, but what I can do is point out just a couple of things that are happening here. And the first thing that I want to say is, by way of disclosure, this is the poem for me where everything clicked. I'd been studying poetry forever, and I read this first line at the right moment in time for me to appreciate what was possible in language. It's called Litany in Which Certain Things Are Crossed Out. The first line is, "Every morning the maple leaves." Period. What? How do you make sense out of that? If the average sentence in English goes subject, verb, object, in other words, the child kicked the ball, every morning the maple leaves, what? They verbed what? The maple leaves verbed what? What's their object? They didn't. The maple leaves. Every morning the maple leaves, which implies that I see the maple leaves, that the speaker of the poem sees these maple leaves. So the speaker is already erased from the poem. They're already crossed out from the poem. What we have instead is the physical environment. What's more, the specifics of that physical environment suggest temporality, at least in my reading of the poem. Maple leaves for me evoke a sense of the autumnal, of fall. We see, when I think maple leaves, I think of different colors. And in that way, I also think of time and seasons and change. And this might be me reading of the poem too much, but the sentence stops short. Every morning the maple leaves, and it has an implied speaker. So then the question for us immediately becomes, who is the speaker? And so we look to the next line, and it says, every morning, repetition of the same environment, another chapter moving into the fantastical, where the hero shifts from one foot to the other. Now we have a hero. The first populated figure in this poem is a hero. And then what happens? Well, we can't really figure a hero next to the phrase, you will be alone always and then you will die. So then we try to figure out who the speaker of the poem is. And it doesn't seem to be a very nice one if it's one who says, I'm sorry I came to your party and seduced you and left you bruised and ruined, you poor sad thing. Well, what happens next? The poet brings in a lady, a singing lady, brings in a dragon, and then says, I can tell already you think I'm the dragon. That would be so like me, but I'm not. I'm not the dragon. I'm not the princess either. Who am I? I'm just a writer. I write things down. So the speaker hasn't been present in this poem in any explicit way for half a page here. And then they say, I'm just a writer. So we think that's who the speaker is. But of course, as we keep going on in the poem, at different times that speaker claims to be the dragon. At different times, the speaker claims to be the princess, claims to be the writer again. At other times, the speaker gets crossed out of the poem, just like everything else in the poem gets crossed out. All of the good things, all of the permanent things of life get crossed out of this poem. So as you're thinking about who your speakers for your poems are going to be, as you intentionally revise your poems into different speakers, or start one with an imagined ridiculous speaker like a frickin' red poppy in mind, consider some of these things. How can we, for instance, foreground the fact of its non-humanness as a way to help us understand what is human? Or how can we let the speaker shift such that they are at one point the writer and at one point something completely different, and make a poem whose narrativity is more complicated for the fact? Finally, I'd like to encourage you, of course, to complete the readings, but specifically to look at JoJo's by Christopher Davis and talk about how you see him achieving a sort of emotional distance in this poem. And the way that I would encourage you to do that in your notes is to look at some of the organizing principles. Talk about tone, where that's relevant. Talk about syntax where that's relevant. Anything that you see under an organizing principle is fair game for talking about how this speaker achieves a sort of emotional distance from what is a pretty high voltage situation. We've got a really, really awesome class coming up in a couple of days on the dramatic monologue. Understanding that the speaker is not the poet and can be anything is a pretty good first way to start thinking about the monologue. So for now, just look through this packet, identify who the speakers are, identify some other aspects of the speaker or the structure of the poem or the gestures, the agon, the specific addressee if you can. And you're not required to take notes on any of this. This is just a guide for you to hopefully be able to start thinking through these questions in a way that's productive for your own writing. Okay, thank you. I'll see you soon for the dramatic monologue.